um, with short stories, I want to talk about this.
Absolutely.
So, what would you define makes a good short story?
For me, and this is something that we talked about at length in my like fiction writing classes at IUPUI, is short story writing, because that's basically all we had time to cover. Like if
Sure.
you want to do a workshop, if you want to do a writing workshop course in college, you don't have time to cover a novel. You have to write short stories and you workshop those. And oftentimes you don't even workshop the whole thing. You workshop sections because if you have 20 people in a class, even if you're meeting for 16 weeks, you just don't have the time. Um, but basically, the point of a good short story is it's essentially the same formula as a full-length novel or maybe a mid-length novella. It's just truncated down to maybe 20 pages tops, preferably 10 or preferably 10 to 12 or less, somewhere in that range. And you want to have narrative arc, you want to have character development, you want to have motivations, you want to have background, and especially if you're doing sci-fi world building, or genre fiction, at least maybe not necessarily just sci-fi, but world in genre fiction especially, you want to have world building. You want to have all the elements of, if you're whether you're doing a 10-page short story or 1,000-page epic novel, you want to have the same formula. It's just going to be at different scales. So
Sure.
you're going to have narrative rise, narrative fall. You're going to have character development, like I said. You have all these things, but you're going to be doing it with different beats. Because if you're going to be doing it in a 10-page short story, you got to hit those beats at a lot faster clip. Because if you're not hitting the rising action until like page 3 or 4, then you're not going to have falling action until like page 9 or 10,
Yeah.
or maybe like 16 or 17,
Yeah.
depending on how fast spaced out your writing is. So you want to hit those beats at a faster clip so that you can get through the story, because at the end of the day, that's basically what you're trying to do. You're trying to get through a story. I mean, that's kind of a flippant way to put it, because you're not just trying to write a story just to finish it. And if anyone has ever written a story just to write a story, they're doing themselves and their readers a disservice, and their potential readers a disservice. You should never write just to write. If you're going to publish, I write just to write for fun, but then
Yeah.
I clean it up for publishing.
Yeah.
That's where editing and revision comes in. But the whole point of writing for publication is you're trying to accomplish something, whether even if it's something simple, just like your characters should want something, even if it's as simple as a glass of water. That's the classic trope from, I want to say Vonnegut, it might have been someone else, it might have been Raymond Chandler, I can't remember. But the old trope about how your character should want something, even if it's simple as a glass of water. You as a writer, as an author, should want something, even if it's as simple as, I want to sell some stories. I want to sell this to some magazine and maybe make some money off it. That may seem simple, but even that is an accomplishment. And
Well,
go ahead.
I think of it, well, a couple of things. I mean, me, my origin story for all this is I didn't think anybody would publish me, so I thought, I should just start a publishing company. Because it'd be simple, not a lot of work. But for me, a short story, stories are, you're conveying ideas, and a short story is you're conveying one idea.
Mm-hmm.
There's one big idea,
yeah,
and everything else has to support that idea, and you don't have a lot of space for anything extra, right? Novels, if it's, or novella, if it's 50,000 words, you've got space to develop other characters
mm-hmm.
or other ideas.
Yeah.
But if it's 5,000 words, you don't. You've got space, or 500 words. You got space for one idea, and every other word has to support the development of that one idea.
Precisely.
And like with the story Epitaph for Bipeds that we just finished, mm-hmm. and is scheduled for New Year's Day, January 2024. The idea is kind of like, it was not quite Battlestar Galactica. There's a line in Battlestar, because it makes me think of it. It goes, life here began out there. But the reverse of that, where, they're like, because it's in the future and there's aliens, and they're like, well, where did we come from? Did we come from this system we're in, or did our ancestors come from a different or different solar system? And that's the question. The question, the idea that that story posits is, where are we from? Who are we? Right. And the end result of that story we put together, every piece of it supports that question, tries to answer it. It says, who are we? Right. Even when we're developing characters that don't really have anything to do with that. Like there's, the main character is a scientist that gets to go to an expedition to a different planet. And the first, I don't know, 400 or 500 words, he has a brother, right? Or a sibling or a podmate or whatever. Now, we spend a few lines here. They're developing that character, right? Now, that character itself doesn't support the idea, the question, who are we? But that character contrasts with the main character who asks the question, who are we? So the simple contrast of that first brother character inadvertently develops the main character, the protagonist of the piece, which I thought was brilliant job on your part.
It's one of those things that character Kinaway, I kind of fell into because I thought it would be cool to have a character who could be a foil to Jira, the main character. And it's one of those things where I hate to make it sound like writing is easy, because kids, writing ain't easy. But if you absorb enough stories in your life, you can probably write something. This is why I encourage people to try writing, try storytelling, because a lot of people have the gift who don't think they would. Because basically anyone who's read books in their life, especially lots of books, anyone who's watched movies or TV in their life, especially lots of them, you've probably absorbed the basic formulas of storytelling, even if you don't really notice, even if you don't really realize it. Because a lot of the stuff I learned, or that I know, maybe not even learned, I didn't learn in a classroom. I learned by watching movies and TV, reading books, listening to audiobooks, and just sort of absorbing it piecemeal, sort of through osmosis. And a lot like stuff like Kinaway and Kinaway's relationship with Jira. It kind of just sort of naturally happened. I didn't really plan that. It's just something that sort of happened. And when you look at it as a sort of a more or less neutral third party, obviously not as neutral as say a completely neutral reader would be, but when you look at it as third party and point out, oh yeah, this is developing Jira's character by using Kinaway as a foil, I'm like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I was doing. I just didn't realize it.
Yeah, I get that, man. I mean, I'm the editor for the piece, so I'm looking at things from more discussion.
Yeah, you're looking at things through. It's kind of like what we talked about, I think, in our last recording session, or maybe the one before that, about what masters do these characters serve? What purpose does, when we're talking about for the Erebus effect, what purpose does Janet serve? What purpose does Alyssa serve? What purpose does Zero serve? The assassin, all these things. That's the thing. What purpose does Jira serve? What purpose does Kinaway serve? What purpose does Professor Solus serve? And these are basically their roles. Professor Solus in Epitaph for Bipeds, or Epitaph for Bipeds. God, what am I trying to say? He is basically the aged voice of wisdom that sort of it's kind of like again, literally the professor character who pulls back the curtain a little bit and lets you see into a new world, but then lets the curtain fall back into place and says, when you're ready.
Exactly.
It's kind of like it's basically the Wizard of Oz.
Exactly. Let me ask you this. And so, serving as the editor on the piece, and you're probably familiar with my editing style, is that I will cut a story probably about 10% more than it needs to, right? Just because I'll notice that too. And that's when I know I'm done. because when I've cut the story to the point where it's no longer functioning. And then I'm like, oh, okay, so then all of the fat has been trimmed, so let's add some shit back on it.
Mhm.
And so the way I'm liking our sort of part, and granted, I'm also serve as like a co-author on a lot of things too, but
Mhm.
also as an editor, our relationship there is I'll cut a thing and then you'll kind of like add some, I'll cut it 10% too much and you'll add 15% more, and then it becomes a really good lean muscular story.
Yep.
And but I noticed when I was kind of cutting Epitaph to the bone, what was your feeling there? What was your response as the author? How did you feel about me wanting to just cut that thing down to like just the bare bones?
Well, I mean, it makes sense because sometimes, as you put it, and as the classic trope is, sometimes you got to kill your darlings, and sometimes there's probably some stuff in Epitaph for Bipeds that I would have maybe preferred to have kept. But at the end of the day, I let myself rely on you as the voice of authority, because I decided, he can see this from a perspective that I don't have, because for me, it was all invented in my head. So I, first of all, hold it kind of dear because it's, kind of near and dear because I created it. So it's like my baby. But at the same time, I'm kind of holding some of these tropes and things near and dear because I think they make sense, even if they don't necessarily really make sense.
Mm,
So to have someone else who can look at this with a more detached perspective and
yeah.
then tell me, well, we don't need this because it doesn't really add to the story. It's distraction, or we can cut this because it shortens things and makes them more brief. Because that's another thing about short stories that I kind of was wanted to get at a second ago is not just do you have to make the points fast, make the beats, like the story beats faster. You have to hit more with less.
Exactly.
If anything, storytelling from a like a short story perspective is harder in many ways than being long, because um, you got to do more with less. You have to. It's kind of like how the old monster movies, or at least certain monster movies like Jaws or Alien, or The Thing, where they don't necessarily. I guess The Thing doesn't really count if you think about it, but things like Alien or Jaws, they don't show you the monster most of the time, and you fill in the imagination, you fill in the blanks with your imagination. That makes it 100 times scarier than if they just sort of had the monster parading around the whole time. It's the same way with storytelling. If you leave gaps for the readers or viewers or whatever's imagination to climb in and fill those gaps with their own putty, that imagination will do more than you can ever do as an author or as a storyteller. Um, and it's the same way. It's especially that way with short stories, because the things you leave unsaid, the things you leave in the white space, are almost as important, or if not more important, than the things you actually say. So, say you've got, like you said, 5,000 words, or maybe 500 words. The things that you leave out, but you imply, or that you sort of allude to, those things are 10 times as effective as the things you actually say, because the reader will guess on those implications, and not only guess on those implications, you get 10 different readers, you get 12 different interpretations, and they will argue over them. They'll meet in online forums and argue who's right, and they'll like go to conventions and they'll debate who's right, and then you got yourself some real discourse going, and that's how you build fandom, which is a whole nother story.
And we will get there one day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a short story guy. I think the longest thing I ever wrote was 22,500 words, which was
Mhm.
Liberation of Earth. So moving on from that, I
Sure.
wanted to talk to you about publishing contracts.
Mhm.
And as a guy who has signed a couple of different publishing contracts with an independent publisher, if you were going to talk to authors who are wanting to sign with somebody, what would your advice be to them, and what would you look for, and yeah, what makes you keep signing with me, that
Well,
sort of.
I think well, really, the number one thing that makes me sign with you is that I know you and I trust you. Because I don't think you as Derwin Lester Derwin Lester II are going to try and just pull faster on me and be like, oh, he won't notice this if I slip it in here and use this vernacular and I can screw him over and get an extra 10% of the proceedings, stuff like that. It doesn't happen between us because we know each other and we respect each other and we
For several
trust
years.
each other. Yeah, we've got this rapport, we've got this friend relationship, and we've got a professional relationship. It's different when you're in the professional world because a lot of times you don't know the people you're signing with that well. It's one thing when you maybe been working with an agent or a publicist or whatever for 10 or 20 years or however long some of these famous authors work with their publicists and agents. But when you're trying to break into that world, you got to be really careful, I would figure. Obviously, I have no experience with that, but say you're trying to sign your first contract and you're not sure if this publisher is going to try and like pull fast on you and get some extra stuff out of this contract that you might not know they're getting out of it. You want to be really thorough. If you have lawyer friends, have them read that contract. That's actually something I did with the contract just recently for a freelancing job that I have. I sent it to my mother who practiced law for 25 years or more. And she read it and got in and said, hey, just ask them about this point and this point, just to clarify, like your ownership rights over the work and, stuff like that. And I asked them and they confirmed, and then I went ahead and sent them the signed contract. But stuff like that, just little tricks like that, send it to your lawyer friends, maybe ask again, this depends on how well you've done, how much initial trust you have, but ask them to discuss it with you. Just tell them, hey, I'm just trying to be thorough, just trying to make sure that I've got a good understanding of what is going on here. Because, a lot of people kind of proceed from the notion that people are going to be mistrusting and scoundrel and scurrilous or scandalous or whatever you want to call it. It's not my experience. If you sort of meet with people at a common level and then treat them with respect and honesty yourself, they'll kind of meet you halfway, and they'll basically treat you on that same level. You just got to be honest with them. Be like, hey, I want to make sure that we're on the level on this contract that I'm going to sign. Would you mind discussing it with me so that I understand all the legalese that may not be, because that's how contracts are written. Contracts are written in legalese, not necessarily to purposefully confusing, but just because that's just naturally how they are. Legalese as a language, as a dialect, comes by itself naturally. It's not something that's necessarily meant to obfuscate meaning. It's just part of how lawyers like to write, and it's how lawyers talk. So
it's a common language that okay, like the law is rules that we as a society have agreed on.
Yeah.
And legalese is the language in which those rules are communicated. And I would say, much to your point, because I know whenever I publish anybody, whenever I sign contracts or whatever, or have people sign contracts, I say, hey, you need to ask me questions. If you have any questions, if there's any before you sign, let's sit and talk about everything.
Yeah.
And if someone ever says, don't worry about it, just fucking sign it, bro, it's okay, do not sign with them.
Yeah, because it's kind of the opposite of, say, like the Apple user agreement. Everybody and their mother, when they get a new phone, when they get a new TV, when they get a new email address, whatever, they scroll through the user agreement and then they click I accept, I've read and understand, I accept, and then they friggin' go through, because everyone just wants to use it. If you're like one of those people who actually reads the user agreement on a new electronic device or something, you're probably considered a weirdo.
Yeah.
But it's not that way when you're doing contracts like business agreements and publishing agreements, because you should actually read through that. I read through the contract you sent me from line 1 to line 100 or whatever it was, and however many lines there were. I read through that and just made sure I understand this. I understand this. This is talking about who gets ownership of what. This is talking about how we share the ownership. This is talking about how we share the royalties. There's a clause about how, again, I think we talked about this the other day. This is a clause. One of the things I like is how there's a clause in there that covers what to do if anyone ever wants to option the rights for film adaptations or toys or comics, stuff like that. and it covers all the bases. It's not trying to, like, beat around the bush. It's not trying to take me for a ride, so to speak. And I feel comfortable in signing it and sending it on. In fact, I've got it sitting here next to me. I would have sent it on last night, but I didn't want to try and take pictures when it was dark, because I would know I had to turn on some extra lights around the house, and I would have had shadows and shit. So I'll take a picture of it today. I'll take a picture of it today, and I'll send you the picture and the scan, because I did scan it.
The book doesn't come out till January, so this is us just kind of get everything prepped before then. And another thing too is if someone wants you to pay to publish them, then you are the client. And like throughout my entire career, I haven't made money, but I've always hated the idea of taking money to publish somebody, right? Because I never want to be a vanity press. I never want to be, I wouldn't want you, like if you as Nick Oakes only had $500 and that was all the money you had, and I took your last $500 to publish a book for you, and who knows if you make back $500. And sometimes it takes 5 years to make back $500 if you make it back. So that was always important to me too. And I think a sense of, I know as a publisher, I needed to learn how to be more flexible with things. I was probably a little more inflexible back in the day. So, and I know lately I have been looking at Spacer's Saga and Blanket Fort as kind of a second job, and I've been kind of treating it with that level of intensity, with that level of hard work and stuff. Because before, it was, my philosophy was, oh, well, this should be for fun and we shouldn't stress ourselves out too much for this. You should still have fun. You shouldn't put a crazy amount of pressure on yourself. But I think I'm at the point now where I'm like, oh, well, I kind of want to scale things.
Yeah.
And not that I didn't want to scale things before, but
now we've got things to scale.
We have things to scale. We have a focused direction. I spent the first 10 years just learning with all of our other products and all of our other books, which you can find in the store, dividedbybooks.com. And now with the Spacer Saga, which I honestly just really enjoy being a part of, I enjoy writing in, right? And I enjoy not having to be like the person that generates I don't, world building at a massive scale, not my favorite thing, because it's too complicated. There's too many different variables and factors. But if you shrink something down to the human eye level, that's where I live, And so one of my favorite parts of our creative partnership is seeing how you can just keep all this massive world building straight in your head, where I'm like, oh, I can kind of look for the person in it.
I like having found someone who's willing to help me publish stuff and offer, suggestions on how to improve the work and make the work, come to fruition, but is also willing to let me be the final creative word. Because that's something that I think a lot of creatives would just give their left arm for, be able to say, hey, I've got this cool creative, this cool fictional universe that I want to produce. Do you want to work on it with me without trying to take it over and make it 100% your own and make me like sideline me? And a lot of people will never get that, because there's a lot of people who don't find someone who's willing to play in the sandbox with them. They want to like kick them out of the sandbox and say, hey, this is mine now. You very early on addressed it as, oh, well, we're gonna meet in the middle on this, and I really respected that. I've always respected that about this partnership, especially as we've worked on it in this, like, over the course of 2023, as we sort of moved into this new space of working together. And it's just so nice to be able to sort of step back from the business side of things, so to speak, which I didn't really mess with that much to begin with, but to just be able to leave the business side of things in your hands, let you come to me with like creative ideas. Obviously, you've had some really great ones. You had a great idea about the Erebus effect. You had a great idea about how to like promote the Erebus effect just yesterday. I'm still kind of just allowed to sort of tinker with. I'm kind of like the eccentric watchmaker. You know, I'm just sort of I'm in. If there was like a company, like say a watch company, like a family-owned watch company, where one brother was the eccentric tinkerer who was like in the back room of the shop tinkering with like how to make new watches, and the other brother was like also an engineer, was like also engineering trained, but preferred to be in the front of the shop selling the watches. That's kind of what we've got here. I'm the eccentric tinkerer. You're also like creative minded, but you're more of like, oh, I'd prefer to be in the front of the front of the place, like telling jokes with the customers and like selling them the watches, like explaining this is why this watch is so beautiful and how it's so intricately handcrafted. This is why you should buy it. That's kind of what our relationship is, and that is so healthy for me because it allows me to just sort of let my creative juices flow and not have to worry as much about how I'm going to do all these creative, like all these business things, since you've got the experience and you're not only have the experience, you're willing to use it.
Yeah, and I've got 10 years worth of infrastructure I built out of a sense of like, well, no one's gonna post me, so I should just do it myself.
Yeah, exactly.
You
Which
you're really
sounds,
you're really good at taking feedback these days.
yeah.
Like for instance, we try to record Epitaph for Bipeds, and then my wife, who is a fan of your work, but she's reading this and she's like, oh, because like you're so good at taking feedback, and here's why. I'm gonna give you a really good example. She read the previous draft of Epitaph for Bipeds. She said, "Hey, my eyes glazed over in the first two paragraphs, right?" And that's because there was a lot of like exposition at the front end. And I'm like, "Oh, well, what if we cut it down?" And then it
Mhm.
starts off at the conversation with Kenway and goes from there. And she goes, "Oh yeah, that's a lot better." Not that the stuff you wrote wasn't important, but it wasn't necessarily important to that story
Yeah.
on page one. And a lot of the stuff you wrote there we're going to use in future stories, obviously.
Well, I
But
mean, here's the thing.
like
Well, two things.
you being so open to me cutting those first two paragraphs, because my wife, her read, because she's the audience for this story. It's not a military science fiction story.
Mhm.
It's a far future hard sci-fi story, and she's the audience. So if we give it to somebody and they say, "Hey, bro, this does not work. You need to cut this down," and then that's the most valuable thing.
Yeah.
Because you explained the whole thing to me over like a 2-hour conversation once, so I understood where everything went. But I at that point I wasn't a neutral party. I was already invested.
Mhm.
But you do a really good job of keeping your of I guess keeping your ego at the door.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Like,
I think that's a good way to say it. I mean, I think that's admitting that is having a big ego. So I won't
yeah.
necessarily own up to it. But yeah, I try to check my ego at the door. That's a good way to put it.
And I do the same thing with trying to not control the whole process. took me a while to get there. I'm like, oh well, because early on with in this iteration of us working together, I realized, oh, this only works if you, Derwin, are not the final creative authority on the Spacer saga. That's the only version of this that works. If you can give up that, if you can make sure he knows that he's the final creative authority on this, and you're a secondary. Now, my opinion matters, but if there's an impasse, you make the final call. That's how this partnership works. Anything else, it doesn't work. And that's nothing against you or me, but I'm like, it's. Am I making sense here?
yeah, sure. You totally. I mean, it's the ability to sort of let go and let God in a sense, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to say that I'm God by any stretch or any celestial, search for celestial being here. But it's basically the ability to let go and let the other guy do his thing.
You're
Because
letting me do the business stuff. I'm letting you
yes,
you be the creative person.
Yes, because it's kind of what I was going to talk about a minute ago. When it comes to epitaph or bipeds, the stuff that we cut out of the front, like you said, that can be used later if we ever wanted to expand that story into a novel or maybe a realm of Spacer Saga. Um, and at the end of the day, I have to understand that, yeah, stuff that makes sense to me may not necessarily make sense to the target audience because they're going to come into it completely as a blank slate. They're just looking to have a good time. They're not
Exactly.
looking for all the stuff that I intrinsically know, um, and they won't have it. So I have to take that under advisement and understand. Oh well, if we cut these 2 or 3 or however many chapters, and because it comes back to another lesson that I learned several times in my writing classes at undergraduate school, and something that I've learned and working that's sort of been hard. It's been sort of honed through working with you as an editor. Is that I often start my stories sometimes even a whole chapter later before they should be, and that's it's kind of a rule. In many cases I need to sometimes cut the entire first chapter, cut the first page, cut the first couple of paragraphs, whatever, and start because there's a rule in in writing, that, especially shorter writing, but definitely really all writing, all storytelling, that at least one professor I know really hammered on, which is you should start as close to the action as possible. And
Yeah.
basically what that means is you should start as close to the actual inciting event as you possibly can. Like if you can start with the inciting event happening, that'd be great. But a lot of people still do a little bit of setup before that. But the inciting event, there's only so many different types of inciting events. You've probably heard of some of these. There's a stranger comes to town, or then one day within one day it happens. That's the two basic forms of inciting event. And all stories spring from those. So the quicker you can get to those inciting events and kick off the actual action of the story, the better action you'll have, because you won't have all of this lead-in crap. It's kind of like how a lot of 80s movies, like the classic example for me is Karate Kid. I assume you've seen Karate Kid, the original.
I saw Cobra Kai.
Well, the original Karate Kid, it ends with Daniel LaRusso, beating the blonde-haired kid who Danny whatever his name is, Danny Zito or whatever. In the tournament, he crane kicks him and beats him, and then they're celebrating, and Danny's like, "Hey, you're all right, kid, you did good." And then Danny's holding up the trophy, and he looks, Danny, I guess Daniel Russo was holding up a trophy, and he looks over at Mr. Miyagi, and it's like, "We did it, Mr. Miyagi!" And Mr. Miyagi kind of smiles, and then it literally freezes on that shot, goes to credits.
Yeah.
No falling action, no real falling action, no denouement, nothing. It's just the climax of the movie, and then straight to credits.
Yeah.
That's kind of how you want to do an opening. Is the opposite of that. You want to have opening title and then straight into the action. That's how some of the best movies have ever been or have you ever seen Goodfellas?
I have not.
We need to watch that because there's a story from when I went to DC last week that I need to tell you that you won't understand until you've seen Goodfellas. But that's basically how Goodfellas starts. That's how The Dark Knight starts. It starts off literally with this bank robbery that takes us right into the action. Most of the best stories ever told take us right into the action, because then we're right there following along, wanting to see what happens next.
I know in Epitaph for Bipeds, you are correct in that sometimes you begin a story before it needs to start. And
I often end the story after it needs to end.
Well, he's a good editor, that's all.
Yeah.
And I remember the first draft, because you had a bunch of stuff and it was all world building stuff. But then I wasn't really, my interest is sparked right when he's talking to his brother.
Mm-hmm.
And his brother's like, you're going to die in space, right? And I'm like, oh, that's the opening line. That's the most that line there is interesting. It's someone, it tells you a lot. And someone saying to the protagonist, you know you're gonna die when you go to space, right? Our
Mhm.
uncle died when he went to space, and you're gonna die too. That says so much. That says that space travel happens as commonplace. It says that it's dangerous. It says that it automatically gives the protagonist a sense of bravery because other people are saying what you're doing is dangerous and you probably won't make it. And it implies that the person saying it, as you later develop as an artist, is is a layman, and the laymen don't typically go in space. And that one line, that one statement says so much. And so you had two paragraphs, and those are the paragraphs that my wife said her eyes were glazing over at. Wasn't bad information. It was just like lots of world building stuff. And I'm
Yep.
like, oh, well, we should start right where it gets exciting. And then she actually made this point, and I thought it was brilliant. And I think we'll end there because I gotta hop off here in a second.
Good thing.
So when she read the original draft, and then because there was a part where you talk about how the bureaucracy of the university and how they're trying to get funding for this thing, this scientific expedition. And she said that was the most interesting part to her. And but then she said, "Oh, well, that because she said she was a teacher, and that's the most interesting part to her. You're a scientist, so you started the story with a guy explaining how he's a scientist. Me as an ex-soldier, I was most excited about someone saying, "Hey, you know you're gonna fucking die in pain, right?" Like, you know, like my interest got peaked right at the danger part. And and yeah, and so that kind of tells you that, I as your editor, as your co-author, as your publisher, I try to keep in mind that I don't have to know everything. I don't have to be, you know, and because if you go through life saying, "Oh, well, I don't have to know everything. It's good if I know stuff, but it's okay if I don't know everything," then that one statement, that one sentence, "It's okay if I don't know everything," is the most liberating sentence in the whole world. And
Mhm.
it takes all this pressure off you on multiple indexes. But professionally, in our profession that we do together, it takes that pressure off there too.
Yep.
And that says, oh, I could be wrong, and that's okay. Because then they're like, oh, well, then it's not all relying on me. But anyway, for the Blanket Fortress of Solitude, I am Derwin,
I am Nick.
and we will see you next Monday morning at 0700.